Are you there, Michael?
I am here.
Well, welcome to the call, Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Michael Aquino. This is episode 186 of Electronic Harassment and Organized Stalking. And thank you so much for calling in and agreeing so graciously to this interview.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. I thought we'd start out by catching people up for people who might have any misconceptions, who maybe just read the original 1980s paper, and get them all caught up to speed. Because I think you feel that one, the original paper, was unnecessary to have up anymore because of the new book lays it all out in much broader detail. So
yes, a little background in the earlier paper. It was a collaboration between myself and then Colonel, now retired Major General Paul Vallely, who in 1980 was the commanding officer of the 7th Psychological Operations Group in the United States Army. I was his director of research, and we were both somewhat dissatisfied with the current state of psychological operations, or PSYOP as the term is. In the Army at that time, we were still in a sort of a post-Vietnam funk, Vietnam having obviously not worked out very well, and part of what didn't work out very well was the psychological aspect of it, the propaganda side of it, you might say, the hearts and minds that had been emphasized so much and ultimately simply didn't work out well for us. So we sat down to wondering, what is wrong with our approach here? Why wasn't it successful, and what could we do to improve it? And the paper that resulted was about a 10-page paper, and it was more of a sort of lighting, giving a hot foot, you might say, to the PSYOP community in the Army, saying the old methods are clearly not working, and what we need to do is to look a little bit more carefully at what actually motivates people and how we can influence that effectively. So it wasn't really a program or a prospectus of a methodology to be used. It was more or less, as I said, a call to action, you might say, at the time. And we circulated it in the PSYOP community. It didn't think much more of it than that, and was somewhat surprised when a few decades later it surfaced in sort of the internet underground as something for people to get worried and excited about, because it really hadn't been intended that way to begin with. However, in the year 2013, I'm also, of course, retired now as a retired lieutenant colonel of the PSYOP branch. And I began going back to that. And what goaded me to go back to it was a look at the state of the world right now, which is embroiled in this more or less constant warfare situation. If you remember, one of the hallmarks of Orwell's 1984 was that the society existed in a state of perpetual war, and it didn't make much difference who the enemy was. It could switch between Eurasia and East Asia as long as war was going on, and the populace could be frightened into supporting it and aggravated into being angry about the enemy of the moment, and it was really not really relevant who the enemy was. Well, we've been through something of the same show here. Up through the 1980s, of course, the big enemy was communism. And as soon as the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union imploded and we didn't have communism somehow to worry about anymore, then there was a sort of a scrabbling around in the government as to, well, we need a new enemy. We need a new boogeyman to scare people with and for people to be constantly terrified by. And lo and behold, up came fundamentalist Islam.
Right.
And now the buzzword was not communism with an exclamation point after it. It was terrorism with an exclamation point after it. And nobody's quite sure what terrorism is, except that it's really scary. It's the monster under the bed these days. And it's as good a reason as any to invade other countries, that vaguely have some quote-unquote support of terrorism, unquote, and to kill their people and blow them up.
Right.
So this really bugged me. I can't put it more simply than that. And I said to myself, we're supposedly a very intelligent species. We've made it to the moon. We've done microscopic investigations of the atom and so on. And yet, when it comes to social issues, we can seem to come up with nothing better than to just bash each other on the head with clubs. It's just that the clubs are getting more lethal and bigger. And we've got to be able to do better than this. We've got to deal with this question of war, or as I simplify it, phys war, or physical war. So I said to myself, did you have a question?
I was going to say, go ahead. I'll say it next.
Okay. Well, I said to myself, based on my experience after a career in PSYOP and also as an intelligence officer and as a PhD in political science from the University of California, who's taught political science for some years at the university level as an adjunct professor at Golden Gate University, we should be able to come up with a better system than this. But to do this, we have to understand the way the human mind functions. And we haven't gotten that yet here because existing PSYOP doctrine is dealing with the most superficial parts of it. So
the
I went
in thinking and stuff.
Correct. And what I'm getting at is best described by a technical term which you don't find that much of outside of the PSYOP community, but it's called brain architecture or thought architecture. And it has to do with the way your mind functions. And to simplify it, you have about 95% of your thinking taking place at the subconscious level and about 5% of it taking place at the conscious level. And that might sound surprising, but consider
I actually think that's conservative.
Yes, well, well, consider it this way, that the subconscious that we're talking about is sometimes referred to in the psychological field as pattern thinking, which means that we form, from our visual and other sensory inputs, we form patterns of reality. And every day we sort of surf off those patterns. A very simple example is the pattern that we have of a street light that goes from green to orange to red. And we don't think about that consciously every time we run into one because the pattern is already embedded. We just know that when we see red, we stop. When we see green, we go. And usually when we see yellow, we hit the accelerator and try and get through the intersection. That's not the way it's supposed to work. But in any case, that's an example of a very simple example of pattern thinking. But in a larger sense, your entire perspective of reality, what makes things real to you or not real to you, is the sum total of the patterns that have been built up in your brain and remain there. And this is what dictates to you whether you, when you get an impression of something, you decide that it's good or that it's bad. It isn't what you call algorithmic thinking, which is reasoning. That's the 5%.
Right.
Algorithmic is what happens when you sit down and you take a test in a math test, and you have to figure out an equation or something. Then you have to work it out and reason it out. But algorithmic thinking is actually very, very, very short range. We don't have much memory for it. And you can't remember, for example, a math problem very long into the future after you've done it.
It's they say 7 plus or minus 2 bits of information, I think.
Something like that, yes. So algorithmic thinking, or what most people would think is the way they think, is actually very, very ragged and very short and very temporary. A good example of this kind of thing takes place in what most people know of as stage magic. I also happen to be a stage magician. I'm a life member of the Magic Castle down there in Hollywood.
When's the last time you did a show?
Well, I don't do shows there, but my particular interest is in mentalism, as you probably might guess.
Are you a big Darren Brown fan?
Huh?
Are you a big Darren Brown fan?
Yes, sure. And I know quite a few mentalists who are members of the castle, so we talk shop periodically, and a lot of this has to do, of course, with, stage magic is what you might call, it's, of course, simple trickery that a person thinks that he's in charge of his own thoughts, but actually you're leading him down a garden path,
Right.
I might ask you to think of the name, for example, of a European country right now, and then and then take the last letter of that country's name and think of an animal whose name begins with that letter. And then I might ask you to take the last letter of that animal's name and think of a fruit that begins with that letter. And after you have done this, I might ask you if by any chance you happen to be thinking of a kangaroo eating an orange in Denmark.
Wow. I wasn't thinking of Denmark.
So what I did there is an example of a very simple sort of mentalism where there are actually very few countries in Europe whose names begin with D. And once you get to the K, most people will tend to think of a kangaroo because there aren't too many animals.
I didn't even hear you say that it had to begin with D. I just unconsciously picked that up, I guess.
Okay, well, then you have the letter K, and most people will pick kangaroo because it just sort of comes to their mind. It's more familiar, say, than koala. And when you get to the letter O, there aren't too many fruits that begin with the letter O. So actually, I have sort of led you sequentially into a pattern here that you're not really aware of. You think you're making choices, but you're not. I'm actually narrowing it down for you. And yet at the end, I say, oh, I just read your mind. And you say, oh, my gosh, Yeah. So that's an example of very simple mentalism where you're dealing with a person's conscious thoughts, but not necessarily with the patterns. And this, of course, is used for entertainment in the field of stage magic, but it becomes more serious when you're talking about the real world and you're talking about things like life or death issues. Because what the military PSYOP was doing up through Vietnam was working with that 5%. We were putting together pamphlets and radio broadcasts and leaflets and loudspeaker broadcasts from helicopters in which we were trying to argue the other side into behaving a certain way, into thinking a certain way. We weren't addressing the patterns, and that was our big mistake. You can talk to somebody all day, and if you're contradicting the 95% of patterns that are making up their reality perception, then you're just kidding yourself because you're not going to change their mind. You may get some short-term cooperation if you, let's say you make a broadcast and you say, I recommend that your regiment leave that hill right now because we're going to bomb it in about a half an hour. Well, yes, that will get itself across and they'll probably leave. But if you try to suggest to, say, a person who's been a lifelong communist that his way of thinking is argumentatively wrong, you have a much bigger task and you probably aren't speaking to it. You aren't addressing to it because that's his perception of reality. That's the lens through which he sees the world. So MindWar, as I developed it in the 2013 book by that name, addresses the construction of reality patterns and how the brain goes about determining those, and then says essentially, what can we do to influence reality patterns when we're dealing with other people? As it turns out, the brain is much more of an electromagnetic and electrochemical machine than most people realize. So the book spends a lot of time on what are called psychons, P-S-Y-C-O-N-S, psychological control systems, which have to do with a lot of the factors in the electromagnetic spectrum that go into the processing of thoughts by the brain, and its mood and its level of alertness. These have everything to do with brainwave frequencies, such as the familiar alpha, beta, theta, and delta, to air ionization, in which you're much more receptive and positively oriented in a negatively ionized atmosphere than in a positive one, to magnetic fields, to colors, in which you have, again, at the subconscious level, a significantly different reaction to different colors in terms of the mood that you would think you would normally have. For example, if you see the color red, it doesn't really make a difference what that is to you culturally. The color red is an antagonistic color at the subconscious level. If you see the color blue, it's a peaceful and reflective one. If you see the color green, it's a disturbing one. How many colors do you think you see with your eyes?
14, 3, I don't know.
Well, 3. We actually have 3 color receptors in our eyes, red, blue, and green. And all the other colors that we see are constructs of our brain and our experience of reality patterns around us. But they're all a combination of those 3 colors. And a good illustration of that is if you look at the projector on a projection TV set, you'll see that it has basically 3 lenses, red, blue, and green. And how those are projected on the screen creates all the other colors. I give an amusing example of this that a friend of mine in science fiction, George Pal, developed when he did the famous 1954 War of the Worlds movie. And he was designing Martians, and he said, well, let's just simplify them. Let's give them a big red, blue, and green eye, like we have, only it'll be a big one in the middle of their head. So what you're seeing there is just exactly that. A large human eye, the size of a head, which is seeing colors the same way that we do, but we don't realize it that way. So in a nutshell, what we're trying to do when we put all the psychons together is to come up with a way of influencing the human mind away from being hostile and antagonistic and suspicious, you might say, towards being intelligent and cooperative and receptive. Now, this is a long way from talking about things like mind control, because when people hear that term mind control in a conspiratorial way, they tend to think of a government that's actually trying to read your thoughts, your algorithmic thoughts, and to control them.
Right, that's pretty much what this show is about. We think that's happening.
And at the risk of saying something inconvenient to the show, it doesn't work.
Go ahead.
And the reason it doesn't work is, as you probably gather from our conversation so far, that's not the way the brain functions.
They're really good negative stage magicians, and they make it seem like they are.
Yes. So on a very short-term basis, you can trick people, and you can influence them in little arguments, but as far as their reality perceptions, you're not touching those. And this is the big mistake, for example, that the Central Intelligence Agency made when it came up with things like MK Ultra, where it was trying to do what in the business we refer to as LPC, which would be liminal involuntary control of thoughts. Voluntary
Referring to the algorithmic thinking with just blunt force.
Yes, and if you try to use a chemical, whether it's LSD or something else, to control liminal thoughts, which are that 5%, basically you just get a mess. You get a freaked out mess, and it's very unstable and very unreliable, because these thoughts are usually the product of your active 5 senses, and they're very short term. So if you scramble the senses in one way or another, as with drugs, what you get is a mess. And that's what the CIA got with MK Ultra, was a mess. They didn't get what they were hoping to get, which was a sort of a Manchurian Candidate thing.
But what do you say to the people who say Sirhan, shot in the back, not the front? So would you say that just wasn't the way it happened, or that was a success for MK Ultra, or what?
Well, I haven't made a detailed study of the Sirhan thing. You know, I've looked at it kind of casually, but it is possible. It is possible to use. The one thing that the CIA did develop when it was involved in MK Ultra, it did do a pretty good investigation into hypnotism. Mm-hmm. And hypnotism does work, and post-hypnotic suggestions do work, but it's a lot less than you would guess from motion pictures. In other words, it's a very mild, very unreliable kind of thing. And for all the effort that the CIA put into it, they didn't take it very far. In this book that I've written, MindWar, I've gone a lot more into it, and indeed stage magicians know a lot more about it too, because it has to do primarily with a certain amount of getting a cooperative attitude in the person that you're talking with, and then just kind of talking him through what you would like him to think and say and do, whether it's if the person's tired, he may be a little bit more cooperative, or again, if some of these psychons are brought to bear and the mind is more relaxed and more receptive, it may be more effective. One of the interesting case studies here, which is not so much hypnotism, but it'll show you how this same principle can take place on a mass scale, was used by Adolf Hitler when he was conducting his original Nazi Party rallies, you know, those big spectacles in Nuremberg and so on. He realized very early in his career that there were certain times of day and certain mental conditions of his audiences that were much more conducive to getting the reactions that he wanted. In Volume 2 of Mein Kampf, that I quote an extract from in the book, he mentions that at one point in his early career, he decided that for the convenience of his audience, he was going to have a rally in a beer hall in Munich at 10 a.m. on a Saturday morning. So he scheduled it there, and he went there, and there was his audience, and he started trying to rouse them up, and it fell flat. And he states in Mein Kampf, he says, it was a complete disaster. And he said, I was trying to figure out what it was, and then I figured out basically what it was. Everybody was too alert. They were too bright. They weren't receptive. They weren't tired. There was not a sort of a mystical atmosphere like you get in the evenings when you have nighttime and torchlight and things like that. So people were not suggestive. They were just having a good morning and listening to this person up ranting away, and that was pretty much it. So he switched to his more familiar nighttime rallies and got exactly the results that he was looking for. We still do that today when we have football games, often in the evenings, or we have other events, political events that are staged in the evening hours when people are more excitable, more worn out, and more receptive. You'll see it probably happening with the Democratic and Republican conventions, not to mention the actions that will probably be going outside both of them, which will heat up in the evenings and not be so active at 10 a.m. in the mornings when everybody's
pretty amazing
relaxed.
how just in the last 3 weeks it's gone from, the Republican convention is going to be violent to now the Democratic convention is going to be Bernie supporters going nuts against Hillary.
Sure. Well, I was talking with some high-ranking officers the other day, and I said we've got basically 2 active revolutions going on in the country at the moment. You don't think we've got a revolution going? We've got 2 of them. I said, on the left,
it's being televised.
On the left, you've got one that's very much like the French and the Russian revolutions, and it's called the Sanders campaign. On the right, you've got a different kind of revolution, and it's very much like the populist, personality-based ones that brought Hitler and Mussolini into power. And I said, if you don't like the comparison to Hitler and Mussolini, how about Gandhi?
I prefer the Gandhi comparison. I like Trump.
Yeah. So I said right now the Democratic establishment is running scared, and you might say it's not really the Democratic establishment. It's what used to be the oligarchy that runs the United States, and it's now much more of a plutocracy, which means the moneyed class, not just the old landed class.
Did they just go overboard trying to push Jeb Bush versus Hillary Clinton?
There you took the words almost right out of my mouth. That they had this election planned out that it was going to be a couple of cookie cutter candidates. They were going to have Hillary on the Democrats, and they were going to have Jeb Bush on the Republicans. And it didn't make any difference, which one of them got elected. They were both going to be good dogs.
But it was going to be Hillary.
They were going to push the TPP through. They were going to push a similar trade agreement with Europe through. And then, as far as the moneyed people were concerned, the plutocracy was concerned, then whoever's in the White House could do whatever the hell they want as far as opening up the borders, making things like citizenship sort of irrelevant, and getting into huge fights with the Congress about who gets to use a bathroom.
Right, that's really important right now.
Yes. So those are the 2 revolutions that are underway, and obviously the Democrats are going to squash, the Sanders one, because they can't possibly backfire. They can't allow it to happen. But the interesting thing, and I think we can all watch this with some fascination, this is a revolution, and the other revolution that's going on right now is the Trump revolution. So what's going to happen to the revolutionary-minded supporters of Sanders? Are they going to go to Hillary, or are they going to really surprise people and go to Trump?
Yep.
Because what you have with Trump is a person who has been very careful not to come up with a whole lot of policies, except a few catchphrases like, we'll throw all the illegals out. He is running on the basis of his personality, and his personality is let's throw the bums out.
Yeah,
it was the same message that Mussolini and Hitler ran on, which is just put me in charge of things, and you don't have to worry because I'm going to be the savior, and I'll fix things. So don't worry your heads about what I'm going to do once I'm there. Just put me there. And that's Trump's message.
It is scary when you say it like that.
Well, there it is. I mean, it's a pretty cut and dried situation. But
the alternative, it's almost like you have to take that risk.
Yeah, well, because
it's a horrible risk.
The alternative is that you get more of the same that we've always had before. You get the TPP, you get Hillary, you get continued concentration of assets and wealth in the hands of a few, and the rest of the people get thrown under the bus. So that's what people don't like. People are a little tired of being thrown under the bus, so this is what got Hitler elected in Germany. He didn't seize power by a coup. He was elected. He was elected because people were tired of being thrown under the bus. And
it's so interesting that now that you say the 2 revolutions thing, I look back and it's like you saw the seeds of it with on the Democrat side, Occupy Wall Street, and on the right side it was the Tea Party.
Sure. And again, with things like the Tea Party, it's more of an emotional thing than it is a rational thing, because the Tea Party doesn't know what it wants. It just knows what it doesn't want.
Right.
And the similarities, again, that I gave a little earlier to the French and the Russian revolutions were pretty much the same. You had, in the late 18th century, in the French Revolution, you had a lot of very disenfranchised and starving French people looking at a small bunch of aristocrats and saying, well, screw this. Let's throw them out. Let's guillotine them and take their stuff.
If I had told you a year ago that the rise of Donald Trump was about to happen, with all your psyops knowledge and political science doctor, what would you have said? You would have thought I was out of my mind.
No, but with a Trump, you need a personality who can sustain it. In other words, we were ready for somebody like a Trump, but you need a person who's got that kind of an ego and who can sort of surf that kind of need in the public. And that's why, as I said, I give you the examples of people like Mussolini and Hitler, because they were personalities. They realized what the people were looking for, and they spoke to it. They gave them the icon that they needed. They gave voice to the popular dissatisfaction. And if you don't have a person who can do that, then you just continue to have the situation fester until somebody comes along who does. In the case of Russia, it took a while for it to figure out what it was going to do. It went through a brief period of parliamentary system with the Kerensky government after the Tsar was overthrown, and then that just didn't work out. He just didn't speak to people. He just didn't electrify them. And so the Germans, who were very anxious to have World War I ended on that side of them so they could get back to working over the French and the British, took Lenin and put him in a train and sent the sealed train over to Russia and said, okay, here's the guy you want. And the Russians ate it up, because Lenin could get out there and make speeches and electrify people. He was the catalyst that was needed.
So getting back to the MindWar thing for a second here, you mentioned on page 82 that at some point they'll be able to use, you were talking about how with fMRI they can get some distorted images, I think, of what you're thinking up close.
You're talking about what's a fairly new science called functional magnetic resonance imagery, or fMRI. And right. Magnetic resonance imagery, we already have. The functional part of it is a fairly new part that's still coming into its full being. And what we've got here is, it isn't really reading thoughts in an algorithmic sense, but what it can do is it can start to put together, with the aid of computers, it can put together pictures of things that your brain is seeing in a picture. It's like a little television transmission, you might say, so that if you
when we see that in the news, does that mean that in 30 years that they're 30 years ahead of that behind closed doors, or are we really seeing the really cutting edge stuff?
Well, when you see this, I'm not sure what you mean in the news, but when you see...
I mean, like Wired News, they publish stuff about that. That's where I saw the article about that. But,
about fMRI?
Yeah. But
well, it's as I said, it's a very real phenomenon, but it isn't. It can't tell you a person's thought processes. What it can do is it can start to image a picture that a person has in his visual cortex. And it's a very rough thing, so that if you have a person who's hooked up to, the magnetic sensors, and he's looking out the window at a skyline, then you might see the computer rough out something that looks very roughly like a skyline. That's all. So it's a very primitive kind of thing, but it isn't. It isn't at the point where it can actually take a photograph of what you're seeing through your eyeballs by a long shot.
But my question is, do you think that since they reveal to the public that we know publicly that they can do that, do you think that they have something better than that behind closed doors, like the same way they release,
No, as I said, the mind doesn't work that way in terms of the way that your brain processes thoughts. What we have are patterns, which are very, very complex and very, very subtle, and we simply do not have the kind of technology that could even approach that. We can't even find out where those kinds of pattern arrangements are coming from. We know that there's synaptic opportunity in the brain, but it isn't mappable in that kind of a sense. The brain is much more subtle than that, and we simply don't have that kind of technology. It might happen a long time in the future, but definitely not right now. I know there's brain studies going. Yes, there's brain studies going on in places like UC Irvine, where the Army, for example, spent a couple $1 million to see if they could get some emotional and mental feedback from soldiers wearing certain kinds of helmets and things like this. This is really primitive stuff. This is whether you're scared or whether you're happy. But that's all.
At the right after that, you briefly mentioned on that page 82 that they might in the future be able to do it in reverse. Did you mean something like out of the first Matrix movie, where they're able to upload a skill to a person by recording it in one person and then putting another person in that fMRI machine, playing it back somehow so that it encodes?
Well, no, in reverse, what the machine can do is to come up with a very rough idea of an image, and if you hook a person up to the machine and send that through to their brain, then they will get a sort of a picture in the brain very roughly of what the computer has constructed. That's all. But again, we're talking about something that's very, very, very rough, and it's certainly not. It certainly is not, for example, at the level of what some people call remote viewing, which is a complete fiction.
When you see those people from the, I was going to say, when you see those people like McGonagall, those people who are in that program, and they say that they could do it, are they kidding? Or are they?
Yeah, they're kidding. They're kidding. It doesn't work. You don't have that kind of a refinement of thought in the brain, and the only way you can communicate that kind of thing is, again, through the physical senses when you're telling it to somebody else. You can't
tell them at some point.
Yeah, a brain generates less current than an electric light bulb, and it isn't going to go through. It can't even get through your skull, much less fly across rooms or across countries or anything like that. So when you see that going on, and I know a lot of the experiments and the people, for example, at Stanford Research Institute, I pissed them off some time back by exploding this in a paper that I did called Project Stargate, $20 million up in smoke and mirrors, in which I kind of held their feet to the fire, including the Defense Department for funding it, for getting all wrapped up in that Project Stargate that went on in the 70s and 80s there. Because what you're talking about there is stage magic, trickery by people who are trying to put one on. That's all. And if they're good, they're the Uri Gellers, you might say, of the business. And right. Uri Geller was a stage magician in Israel long before he went on and came out as a quote unquote real psychic, and spoon bender. I was at the Magic Castle one evening down in Hollywood there, talking with another magician friend of mine about Uri Geller and his spoon bending. He said, anybody can do that. He said, do you have a quarter? So I fished in my pocket and I gave him a quarter, and he took it in his fingers and he rubbed it, and then he tossed it back to me, and it was bent 90 degrees. I said, you palmed it and switched another one on me. He said, he looked really indignant. He said, I did not. He says, I'll prove it to you. He says, give me your car keys. I said, I believe you.
That's funny. Yeah, I love that clip of him on the Randy show where he's just stumped. I mean, on Carson when Randy set up everything.
Well, Randy, of course, is another really skilled professional stage magician, and he's very good at exposing these kinds of things. And he is actually, very, very adamant about making sure that stage magic is not used to deceive people or exploit them. It's just used to entertain them.
Right.
So he's the bane, of the people who try to use stage magic to BS other people. I'll tell you one of the things that really amused me when I was looking at some intelligence documents about other countries, and I looked at the situation in China. China is practically the birthplace of stage magic, but they have really fallen victim over there to hornswoggling by their versions of Uri Geller's. And it always fascinated me that they would be so gullible that way. The Russians, not nearly so much. The Russians worked very hard from the 60s on up to investigate the entire field of the brain and the mind and psychic phenomena. And most people just saw a little glimmer of it in books like Psychic Discoveries Behind the Iron Curtain and so on. As it happens, you know the name Michael Murphy?
I don't.
Well, Michael Murphy is kind of an old hippie, you might say, out here, but he was the founder of the Esalen Institute down below Big Sur, which is a kind of a place where you go to open up your mind and your brain and schmooze with other people. And he also founded a think tank up in the Bay Area called the Transformation Project with a gentleman named Steve Donovan. So in the 80s, when I was working very intensely in these areas of what you might call the brain architecture and thought architecture and how it works, sooner or later, I ran into Steve Donovan. Actually, the way I did that was that Michael Murphy wrote a book called An End to Ordinary History, which was a very thinly veiled fiction story about psychic experimentation in the Soviet Union. I picked it up in a Berkeley bookstore at some point. I read this book and I said, you know what? This sounds a hell of a lot, that he knows a lot more that he's talking about here than just writing a story. So I got a hold of Michael Murphy and I said, I think your book is not a story. I think it's thinly veiled nonfiction. He said, well, you're right. And he said, if you want to talk about it, he says, you want to talk to Steve Donovan. So Steve Donovan had a nice little apartment down here in the Marina in San Francisco. And his apartment was jammed with file cabinets in which psychic research and mental research from all over the world was in there. I mean, the CIA and the Defense Intelligence Agency had nothing like this. Nothing. So I was like a kid in a candy store. I went in there and I said, Steve, can I just rummage? And he said, be my guest. He was very affable about the whole thing. So a lot of the information, that I used to develop in MindWar began with documentation and things that I first came into when I was looking through the files of the Transformation Project. And
that's an incredible story.
Yeah, well, this happened because both Steve Donovan and Michael Murphy spent a lot of time in the 60s and 70s in the Soviet Union talking with the people back there who were at the very forefront of this kind of experimentation. And the United States, of course, this is a Cold War, so we didn't have our people, our agents or our attachés or anything doing this. They wouldn't have gotten a welcome. But the people like Steve Donovan and Michael Murphy would go over there on their vacation time and talk with these people and get together and have vodka with them and so on and learn all kinds of stuff and then bring it back. So
That's awesome.
Yeah, it was great.
Let me ask you, I heard you say in a recent interview that when you've been confronted about your religion by Christians who have little understanding of the deeper meanings of Jesus and what he represents, and you said something about you tell them, do you want to know what he really represents? He's a symbol of divine innocence. Could you tell us more about that and how that ties in with forgiveness?
Sure. In addition, this, I don't want this to sound like a commercial or anything, but in any case, there's one piece of thought architecture that I didn't go into in MindWar, and it's called conceptual thought. I just mention it very briefly in passing, and say this is the part of your mind that is not traceable to sensory inputs and exports, you might say. This is the creative part of your mind that is basically generating reality whole cloth from itself. This is creativity. This is divine thought. It's what Nietzsche referred to as horizon building. And this last year I almost died from colon cancer, and had a very, very dicey time where I wasn't sure how long I might still be alive. If you remember the first time you contacted me last year, I said, I'm sort of on the brink of not sure if I'm going to be here tomorrow, and you might try back in a few months and see if I'm still here.
Right.
And you did, so here we are. But I said to myself, well, going on the assumption that I'm a dead person or very close to being a dead person, if I'm going to write the book on what people normally call the soul, I'd better write it now because I don't know how long I'm going to have to get it done. So I dragged myself every day over to the computer and I pounded this thing out. And it's a sort of a companion book, you might say, the metaphysical side of your brain. And that's a book called MindStar, S-T-A-R, one word, MindStar. So that deals with the soul. It's a sort of a manual, for people who have a soul as to what it is and how it operates. Now, this plays into your question in the following way, that each of us has a sense of identity. You wake up every morning, you're you, okay?
Right.
But what is you? Is it simply your mechanical body? And are you simply nothing more than stimulus response to sensory impressions and and all these mechanical electronic patterns that are going on? In other words, are you just a machine, or does this thing that we call consciousness suggest that there is something to your identity that is not part of this mechanical process? And my answer is an unhesitating and uncompromising yes. There is a metaphysical aspect to the way that you have consciousness that is not explainable. It's not reducible to sensory input. It is intrinsic to your entire perception of self. It is the thing. If you looked at your body as though you were a person in an automobile and you were driving the automobile, and the person is you and the automobile is the rest of your brain, you might say. So that this thing that is in the driver's seat, which people call the soul, in this book I call it the mind star because the word soul has different kinds of connotations. This is the thing that is the ultimate absolute you, that is not a machine, that makes you completely unique, and also, if you think of it this way, generates the entire perceptive universe that you exist in. Because as you exist every day, you create a universe around you that is your perception of reality and existence. And that's the thing that makes a difference to you. And it's the thing that you also realize that you personally are juxtaposed to. You are not a part of this state of nature. You are a thing outside of it that can appreciate it and can control it and react to it exactly because you're different from it. You have perspective on it. You're like Archimedes, who's got a lever, that he's placed so that he can move things that aren't himself. So this sense of separateness, this sense of outsideness, is something that humanity has had a hell of a time trying to deal with over the centuries. The Egyptians didn't have a problem with it at all. And
how did they deal with it?
Well, they dealt with it very simply. Actually, they dealt with it very meticulously, because they divided what most people would call the soul into 8 different ones. And each one of those has a very careful set of constructions around it, so that when you put them all together, then you get the personality. These were somewhat simplified by the time it went through the Pythagoreans and got to classical Greece and Plato and the concept of the forms. But you still have the notion of the personality that's outside of simple stimulus response. And Plato, for example, explored this most directly in his dialogue called the Meno, in which he develops the principle of anamnesis, which is the recollective basis of knowledge that's independent from what you learn. And this he, of course, demonstrates by taking the slave boy in the dialogue and leading him through reasoning processes that he couldn't possibly have learned, and yet drawing conclusions from them. So you have this situation where you feel instinctively that there's a thing in you that's alien to nature. You don't know what it is. You can call it your soul if you like. That's a nice, simple, generic term. And the question is, what are you going to do with it? You know, are you supposed to try to get it back into nature somehow so that you are harmonious with nature? Or are you supposed to remain outside of nature and use nature as a tool and as a device? We do that every day. Every time we take a tree and we turn it into a table, we're taking something that's nature, and we've decided that since we're in effect gods, we're going to redesign it and use it into something, turn it into something else that it wasn't really naturally designed to be. So we are screwing with nature all the time. We're using our divine prerogative, as if you will, all the time, but we're never really comfortable with that, because we somehow feel that nature is an integral system all around us, and we're not part of it. We're not sort of harmonious with it. And therefore, what you see with conventional religions, all conventional religions, with the exception of the Setian one, because this is the one which focuses on the dichotomy, but all conventional religions they represent humanity's desire to be integrated back into the harmony of nature, to fit in again. This is sort of like, if you like the metaphor, trying to get back into the Garden of Eden and to get rid of that annoying perception of separateness that happened when you ate the apple. Mm. You want to be a nice, dumb animal again that doesn't have to worry about being separate, because it's not, because it's all part of this big harmonious thing. Okay. And that's at the basis of all religions, one way or another, whether it's Taoism or whether it's Christianity or Judaism or Islam. Everybody's trying to get back to God, get back to nature, get back in there to be forgiven for being a separate actor and a thing apart. So what you have with Christianity, backing up a sentence or two, we can't get rid of our separate intelligence, our perception of difference. We can't. You might try to lobotomize yourself, I suppose, but short of that, you're always an actor apart and an actor independent. And you can't go back to being innocent by just wanting to be. You always are thinking of something to do about it. So what Christianity came up with was the idea of an intercession to this. In other words, if we can't get back to innocence, how about if God comes up with somebody who says, well, it doesn't matter that you're screwed up, because I'll let you back in anyway. All you have to do is accept me, and I'll take the heat for you. And there you have the function of a Messiah or a Redeemer or a Liberator as somebody who's basically taking the heat off you. And this is known as grace, in Christianity and Catholicism. You can be the most opinionated, screwed up, self-interested person in the world, and as long as you accept Jesus, it doesn't make any difference because he's going to pay the bill.
Have you read or heard of the book called A Course in Miracles?
I don't think so. Mm-mm.
Okay. It's claims to be channeled by Jesus or whatever. Anyways, okay, so is that what you meant by is that the divine innocence you were talking about? The idea that somebody else...
You would have to get back to a sort of a pre-apple-eating Garden of Eden state of unconscious alignment with the universe to be innocent again, because innocence means essentially the absence of the ability to be different and to think different and to pursue different things. It doesn't necessarily mean that once you have that ability that you're going to do evil with it. Just the fact that you're going to walk in different ways and take a tree and turn it into a table, that's an act of deliberation which was not contemplated by nature. And it also gets to very serious extremes. For example, if someone were to say, well, what's an example of just how dangerous it is to mess with nature, to mess with natural law? I would say, well, a good example of that is the atomic bomb.
Very good example.
Nature, didn't intend atoms to be used this way. In nature itself, you don't see them being used this way. But if you take an atom and you bash it open and you create this giant mess, that's what happens. If you take a very balanced, harmonious system that nature has worked out and maintains throughout the universe, and then you mess with it, you get a catastrophe. And you can get worse ones than that, too, but I mean, that's a pretty good example of it. People say, can you prove that there is a God? Or in my case, we would multiply it and say that there's actually an entire network of things that most people would refer to as gods, which the Egyptians referred to as the Neteru, which are the collective natural principles of the universe or natural law. And I would say, sure, it's very easy to prove that they exist or that to prove that God exists. It's like falling out of bed. And they say, well, how? Because people have been trying to prove the existence of God for, centuries and have always crashed and burned. And I say, look, it's as easy as this. It's the force that keeps things as they are from one moment to the next, that keeps natural law functioning regularly. So that, for example, the force of gravity functions this minute and next minute and the minute after that reliably through the universe and does not change. That enforcement is God or the gods. The fact that things are in a certain way naturally and are enforced to be that way continually. We do not live in a state of universal chaos where everything changes from one instant to the next and there's nothing that kind of keeps things in order. The thing that keeps everything in order, that makes the universe, the natural universe that we look at outside of ourselves, that makes it intelligible to us so that we can then screw with it, that's God, or the gods, or the Neteru. So if you want to blaspheme against God, you smash the atom.
All right. On the one or two more questions, and I'll let you go. I heard on that most recent interview, I think, Dr. J, that I was shocked pretty much that you were so vocal about from day one, just sitting there in the dentist chair, the first moment that you knew it was a controlled demolition, it was a false flag on 9/11. What made you decide to start talking about that? Had you talked about that previously? Because I hadn't seen anything about it.
I've never made any secret of my evaluations of these things because people. This goes all the way back to, I guess you might say, 1968, when I, first went through the Army's PSYOP officer school, which is how they teach you at Fort Bragg to become a PSYOP person. And, you learn the construction of propaganda, and you also learn, and this is sort of, lesson number 2 on day 1. Lesson number 1 is how to create propaganda. Lesson number 2 is don't believe your own propaganda.
Right.
The minute that you do, then you've destroyed yourself, because you've just sucked yourself into the same deception that you're trying to pull, on somebody else. So do not fall victim to your own propaganda. I was talking again with a general the other day, and I said, back in Vietnam, we had a colonel who was the G5, the PSYOP officer of the 2nd Field Force there, who sort of ran interference between us and the super secret State Department PSYOP outfit in Saigon called JustPow, the Joint United States Public Affairs Office. And JustPow kept coming out with all these Mickey Mouse policies, and Colonel Oberst was his name. He was a German. He was a paperclip person, from World War II.
Wow.
And what was really funny was he was a full colonel with the name of Oberst, which in German is Oberst. So he was actually Oberst, which was sort of amusing. But this guy was a real snake. I mean, he said, absolutely, he said, do not ever buy into your own propaganda. You have to get beyond it. You have to get beyond your propaganda, and you have to get beyond the enemy's propaganda. You have to see things objectively, above and beyond that. So one of the things that we have in terms of our own propaganda here is that the United States would never hurt its own people. All right? We're a good country. We would never blow up our own people, would we?
Never.
Not ever. I mean, it's kind of like Boy Scouts, we don't do those things. Bad countries do that, but we don't. Well, you know what? This is not, it's not just something that happens here. This is business as usual. It's been going on that way since the Gulf of Tonkin incident, since the Battleship Maine, since Pearl Harbor. I mean, this kind of stuff has been going on for a long time. The Kennedy assassination. One of my good friends, Fletcher Prouty, retired Air Force colonel, he was the person who was played in the movie as the person X, by Don Sutherland. And he was the protege of Ed Lansdale, who is practically the patron saint, of the PSYOP community, who had written a book on all this stuff and practically created the United States, special forces and psychological operations and so on. Ed Lansdale was pretty much the brains, behind the Kennedy assassination. And he did this, among other things, because he wanted very badly to be in charge of the situation in Vietnam. And he was an Air Force Major General who, unfortunately for him, had a lot of strong ties to the CIA. And Kennedy got a bug up his ass about the CIA after the Bay of Pigs. He didn't want anybody connected with the CIA in any position of power, so Lansdale, who was originally going to be the ambassador down there and in charge of the whole Vietnam thing, wound up on the outside. They just sent him down to Florida to run silly-ass propaganda against Cuba instead, which is what pissed him off, and one thing led to the other, and, et cetera, et cetera. So when you look at something like the 9/11 situation, and I would call your attention, for example, to a very, very good movie that's available. You can probably find it on YouTube, called, I believe it's something like Behind the Smoke or something like that, by Barbara Honegger. And it has to do with the Pentagon aspect of 9/11 and how that whole thing, was a put-up job and basically a false flag. And I was sitting, as I said to Dr. J, I was sitting in a dentist's chair getting my teeth whitened and watching all this stuff in New York going on. And I watched these two buildings just drop down in nice, neat puddles, whoop, whoop, like that. And that isn't how buildings fall down. They don't do it like that anyway. Did you see The Lord of the Rings? Well, at the end of The Lord of the Rings, when Frodo threw the ring into the mountain and Sauron's Barad-dûr came down, it didn't drop into a nice, neat little puddle. It just fell over, okay?
Right.
Whomp. That's what happens, with big buildings. They don't come down really neatly like a pancake. So I looked at that. I saw, building 1 came down, and then building 2 came down right after it. Like a whoop, whoop, like this. And building 7 came down just for the hell of it, Wow.
Just for the hell of it, yeah.
And I said to myself, oh, okay, demolition. And that's all I needed to know right there. It doesn't
were you at all concerned, or did you think, wow, this is pretty blatant? Like, I mean, flying a plane, 4 feet off the ground in the Pentagon of all places. Are people going to buy this? Did you think that at all, or?
People, you would be surprised how easy it is to tell people what to believe, and they believe it if they. I mean, this is the big lie, kind of thing. People believe what they want to believe, and this is one of the big secrets of PSYOP, that it isn't that you are changing people's opinions. People come up with their own opinions based on these patterns that they've had their whole lives. One of those patterns is that the United States doesn't hurt its own people. So all you have to do when you get an event like this is you feed that pattern and you say, no, this wasn't the case of the United States hurting its own people. This was the case of, I don't know, some crazy Muslims, back in Afghanistan hurting some people.
Right. They think if you're going to hurt their own people.
Yeah, okay. Let's go get them, And you give people what they want to hear, and they'll go for it. And they want very badly to be reassured that the United States would not do these kinds of things. This is the sad truth of humanity, that there hasn't been a nation in the history of this planet that hasn't done things to its own people for, convenient or opportunistic reasons.
Right. And you were talking about the fake Bin Laden death. I actually made a video about that before Wolf Blitzer even got on the thing. It was just Obama's going to give a speech, probably Osama's dead, and I got to the front page of YouTube. But anyways.
Yeah, I'm not in on the Navy, as to what goes on within the Navy SEALs that much, but I can tell you this, that I know enough about Pakistan's Air Force and its air defenses to know that you aren't going to take a bunch of helicopters and sneak them across Pakistan without Pakistan noticing and stopping it, unless they knew about it beforehand and let it happen. So the idea that this was some sort of a sneak-through mission is silly to begin with. And also, we're talking about theoretically, an old live man who it would have been duck soup for a group of special operations people to capture alive. Right. You could do it with tear gas, And why in the world, if it's somebody as important as Bin Laden, who supposedly knows all there is to know about Al-Qaeda and the rest of it, why in the world would you want him dead? You would want him alive. And by the time we hear that, they'd
dump him in the ocean.
You would want him alive so that you could take him back here, question the hell out of him, interrogate him, get him talking. That's what you would want to do with him. And if let's say you did kill him by accident, somebody was stupid and shot him, would you dump his body out at sea? No, because then then you make it impossible for anybody to do some DNA analysis and prove that it really was him.
Like the birth certificate, it's just a blatant lie.
Yeah. So I mean, this stuff is a giant red flag that tells you there's bullshit being shoveled here, and you don't need to know the details. Once you know that it's bullshit, that's really all you need to know, and then it's just a question of, okay, so there's just some more bullshit going on here.
I know, but there's one particular detail of that bullshit I would like your opinion on. After they did it, a few months later, they released a list of books they said he had in there, and he had 9/11 conspiracy books, they said. So what would be their psychological warfare reason for saying that Bin Laden, who they want us to believe did 9/11, for him to have books saying that the U.S. did 9/11?
Well, a lot of it has to do with just simple misdirection. The U.S. government's very nervous about things like the 9/11 truth movement, stuff like that. It doesn't want people looking in that direction. So if it can come up and say, well, these guys were so sophisticated, these bad Arabs, that they were actually sowing the seeds for the conspiracy theories about themselves too, then of course you have that excuse, and you can say, see, even the conspiracy people are just the dupes of these very bad old nasty Islamic extremists.
or
I
guilt
know,
by association.
I know Muslims.
I guess.
I know Muslims, and you know Muslims, and a Muslim is not a monster with horns and fangs and tails. It's a human being.
Right.
Muslims are nice people, as long as you don't, kill them or blow them up. We've gotten along with them fine for hundreds of years. I mean, it isn't as though Muslims suddenly appeared in the United States at the turn of the century here. They've been here a long time. We've been getting along with them just dandy. All right. The only friction we've had with the Muslim world is over things like Israel, where obviously there's a certain amount of annoyance there, but it's not really religious based. It's just turf based, But who gives a damn about what name you give the Judeo-Christian God? It's all the same God. Some people, celebrate Christmas, and other people celebrate Hanukkah, and some people pray to Mecca. So fucking what? Excuse my French.
Last question, and then I'll let you go, and then or you can plug your books and then tell us where you can get your books. And then the last question I'd like to ask is, let's say I was to join the Temple of Set, and if somebody who advances and gets the most out of it, what would their life be like once they're fully a Setian?
Well, I tell people, and I've said this since we founded it in 1975, I said, think of the Temple of Set as a toolbox. It's an initiatory toolbox. Initiation is the process of clearing all the crap out of your mind and realizing exactly who you are and what you can do with yourself, which in reality turns you from an animal into a god. Because the more you're in control of yourself, then the more your actions approach what normal people would call the divine, and not simply the animal active reactive or the instinctive. So the Temple of Set is a vehicle to facilitate personal initiation. And we simplify that. We call it a toolbox because initiation necessarily differs from individual to individual. You can't cookie cutter this thing. You don't turn out a standardized Setian. The Temple of Set is like herding cats. If you come to one of our meetings, no two people are even closely the same. It is a bunch of individuals as extraordinarily different as you could possibly imagine. And it's a blast because we're celebrating the phenomenon of individuality. We just maximize it, and we do it in a cooperative way. So
it's kind of like the Milton Erickson version.
Yeah, so the doctrines and the documents that we have are all assistance. These are things that people have learned over the years that help them with their personal initiation, and they think that it might be useful to other people. So if you, for example, I've taken a big slab of what I know about the Temple of Set, having been the high priest of it up to 1996, and I wrote all this up in a book called The Temple of Set. It's a 2-volume book. It's available on Amazon, since we're mentioning my books. It tells about the founding principles and the early history of the temple, and the second half of it is a large theoretical compendium that goes into its metaphysics, its philosophy, its attitude towards things like magic, and so on. And so help me, this stuff isn't rocket science, and it isn't mysterioso. It's right there in front of you. This is where, you remember what I said about Plato and anamnesis, that you know all this stuff to begin with? You just have to kind of bring it into focus. Right. Well, initiation is like that. As you go through it, you realize you know all this stuff already. You're just looking at it in a nice, fresh way. But it isn't as though you're being an old dog who's being taught new tricks. It's the same old tricks you've known all the way along. You just weren't paying attention to them, that's all. So that's what the Temple of Set is. Yeah. It's a toolbox. That's what it is. That's how it works. That's why it's
kind of like NLP in that way.
Yeah, I mean we don't worry about people being orthodox Setians. We don't worry about whether they do the right thing or not, because that's exactly what we aren't. So we don't have heretics. It's not like Scientology, where if you leave it, you're a threat or something like this. People come and go from the Temple of Set all the time. They try out the toolbox, they use it, and some people find that the stresses of being a divine consciousness are a little rough on them. They would rather be a little bit more of an animal and
we're
fall
afraid
back
of our own power, isn't that it?
Sure. What Eric Fromm called escape from freedom, what makes people relax sometimes in
too much
more
responsibility
environments. Yes. So some people will try out SETI and initiation and find that it's too much for them. And they'll try it out for a while, and then they'll leave it. And some of them will go find something else. They'll become Taoists or Buddhists or Catholics or whatever. That's cool. Whatever fits you, whatever makes you feel comfortable with yourself is perfectly fine with us. We just simply have this as an initiatory environment. And again, just sort of mentioning what you were saying a moment ago, all of my books are available on Amazon in both paperback and Kindle form. So if you go up to Amazon and you type in Michael Aquino books, you'll see the whole bunch of them. Most recent ones, one called We Break the Sword, which is an alternate history about how World War II could have been ended without further bloodshed in 1940, as long as Adolf Hitler was a bit more reasonable than he was. And a Star Wars parody by the name of Fire Force, which just went up a week or so ago.
Very cool. Well, I hope to have you back on at some point, and we'll discuss how to get President Trump on board with the MindWar program.
Well, we'll work at it. He's there are a lot of people who think that once he calms down and quits beating on his chest so much that he's a good, sensible person. I'm not really sure at this point. I know that I don't want to see President Hillary. That would make me very unhappy.
Yeah.
Bernie Sanders sounds nice, but I think he'd have a hard time paying for it. Like Maggie Thatcher once said, after a while, the problem is you run out of other people's money.
Yeah.
And, then you have
Trump with Bernie would be amazing.
Sure. I mean, everything I hear from him is great. But somewhere along the line, somebody's going to have to pay the bill.
Mexico.
Yes, yes. Well, Mexico might pay the bill for a wall, from confiscated money, but they aren't going to fund everybody through college, and they aren't going to pay for universal Medicare. So right. Bernie has a bit of a problem there, and he isn't going to have a very cooperative Congress, certainly. But I think that the Hillary people, unfortunately, will torpedo him before he gets the nomination, which is sad because I think that it would be a great popcorn event if we had an election between Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. That would be a really fun campaign to see.
It'll still be amazing, but yeah, it'd be two non-establishment candidates would be the best thing.
Yeah, that'd be great. Then you have basically two revolutions going on. Which revolution would you guys like? The one on the right or the one on the left?
just as long as they don't combine, because then you got nationalist Trump and socialist Sanders, you get national socialism again.
That would be something else. Yes.
You're gonna pass on national socialism over here, I think.
Uh-huh.
All right. Well, this has been a really great talk. I hope we can get you back up again someday.
Oh, sure. Anytime. And thank you very much for inviting me. I think this has been kind of fun, and I hope that your audiences have had some of their insights stimulated a little bit. Again, like Plato said, this is all stuff that, if you think about it, you probably knew this show already. Everything that we've talked about, you probably knew. You just had to have it you just needed to get goosed a little bit. And
you got to shake off the dust.
Yeah. We're in anamnesis land here.
Well, this has been episode 183 of Electronic Harassment Organized Stalking. Our guest has been retired Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Michael Aquino of Temple of Set. And thank you so much for calling in again.
It's been my pleasure.